So, a few weeks ago now, I was there, minding my own business, when who would pop into my feed but the great Law Reloaded with a new video about how evil the Federation is. Where to start? Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and yes, today I'm going to be dismantling another of Law Reloaded's videos. He keeps insisting on making them, and I think he wants an argument, so I'll give him one. Please don't bully or harass Law at all. This is just purely in good fun. I also wanted to do this video because actually it ties in very nicely with something that Commander Sean Farrell requested I talk about, that being Admiral Leightons' coup, and that actually does feature quite prominently in this topic. So without any further ado, we'll get into it. There's a few things that you need to understand when it comes to the arguments that Law Reloaded makes in his video. And essentially, he makes an awful lot of assumptions, he makes bad faith interpretations, so he basically assumes the worst case scenario. So because somebody could do something means that they are doing something. And that's really the basis of his argument. He doesn't provide solid evidence to show that the Federation is evil, but he says, oh, well, this is an avenue through which the Federation could be evil, and therefore is evil. Okay, so his first and strangest argument is about control of the media. And essentially this really just looks like that he's just drawing on Picard, when he kind of ignores the fact that the way the media is operating in Picard is very much in a sort of adversarial capacity. They're poking Picard, not because they've been told to do so by any state censors necessarily, but because of that's how Western media operates. You know, in American media, you'll have your talking heads, and here is the talking head that you agree with, and here is the talking head that you don't agree with, and the two will go at each other, but the network makes sure that the talking head that you agree with is the one to get the last word in. On British television, the presenter will frequently take on devil's advocate, so if they're speaking to a politician or activist, something like that, they'll interrogate their views from potentially a variety of different angles. They won't just stick in one spot. They'll attack from every different vector they can to probe for weaknesses. That's especially a thing we do in British culture, is we take on devil's advocate in order to test positions that we may well agree with, but we want to poke people. It's a bit of fun. In any case, there's no real evidence of state control in the broader canon of Trek. Jake Sisko is our best example of a journalist, and Jake Sisko has no censors breathing down his neck. The closest he gets to a censor is Wei-Yoon, who was actually a pretty benign censor. He just says, no, I'm not going to send that out. You can write it, but I'm under no obligation to publish it. The only kind of censorship we see is during a wartime situation where, media censorship is kind of important for security purposes. The same thing was done in World War II, and different nations had different approaches. If you've watched the World War II channel's video on D-Day, they talk a lot about how the news was presented and actually how there was a big difference between how American journalists were able to cover the war compared to British journalists, who were a lot more tightly regulated. The second half of this argument hinges around the universal translator. So number one, he says that the universal translator was made by Starfleet engineers. Starfleet Communications would like a word with you, Law Reloaded. It also assumes two things. Number one, it assumes that everyone is using Starfleet model universal translators, when, again, this is diverse technology. Everyone in the galaxy has some kind of universal translator. The Ferengi have universal translators. This is a fairly broad technology. So where there's an open market, it's difficult for anyone to really control the technology. And, exploitation or manipulation of that technology would probably go noticed by the people who weren't tampering with universal translators. This is an example of where he assumes bad faith and says because they can, they are. He's quite right in the observation that the universal translator has the ability to manipulate and shift language. There is that means. However, he misunderstands the nature of the universal translator and the broader galaxy of Star Trek. Starfleet does not have a monopoly on the universal translator technology. Many other species have it, and if you were to start messing around with it, they'd notice. People would notice. He says that the state media is pro-war, and he's citing the example from Picard. Number one, they are not inciting war or xenophobia. They are presenting a devil's advocate argument. Because that's what the media does, in order to get a reaction. This isn't something that is state-sponsored. This is the media trying to get a scoop, trying to get a rise out of Picard, which they succeed in doing. There's no evidence that the media in the Federation is state-controlled. There's far, far more evidence that media is an extension of, the modern world, which I think Gene would be quite on board with. The ability for anyone to publish their own ideas and get them out there. And I think the Federation, from what we can see, does have that. Okay, his next argument is regarding quote-unquote wrongthink, or the Marquis. Now, he conflates people's beliefs with people's actions. The Marquis' ideas were not the problem. Their ideas and their ambitions were not necessarily the problem. The means by which they pursued them were the problem, where they used political violence and terror in order to get what they want. That was the problem Starfleet had. Not that they had disagreeing ideas about how Federation citizens should live, but that they used violence to attempt to implement that, and Starfleet did have a significant problem with that. Now, you might say it's because Starfleet is the state arbiter of violence. You've heard that expression there, that the state is the ultimate authority on violence, and you may have a point. However, fundamentally, Starfleet was using its capacity for violence in order to try and stop and restrain the violence of its citizens. So it was not because of their beliefs that the Marquis were persecuted and criminalized. It was because of the criminal actions that they took consistently and without apology. Now, this follows into the topic of Starfleet acting as a police force. He presents really very little evidence for this. There may be some argument in the original series, where Starfleet very much is acting as a frontiersman. Is the only kind of law and order you will get is a roving constitution class coming to right the wrongs and shoot the guy in the dark hat. The only law that Starfleet enforces in the 24th century is interstellar law, is international law, which they are obliged to uphold by their various treaties. That's what Starfleet has to uphold, is interstellar law, and potentially, they might be called on to enforce federal level law, but that is exceedingly unlikely. His final example is the use of blood screenings in Paradise Lost. Something that I will point out was probably revoked at the end of that story when Sisko realized what was happening to the Federation. The episode itself diffuses Law's argument. He's right in that there is the potential for that to happen, but because of the nature of the Federation, they do not follow through on that opportunity. They do not take that opportunity. They do not take the easy path. His next point is the most puzzling, by far, and that is that Starfleet is run as a military in a top-down command structure, and therefore is authoritarian, and therefore the Federation is authoritarian, because the structure which protects and upholds the Federation is authoritarian. I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that Law probably doesn't understand how military command structures operate, and that there is an awful lot more to them than authoritarianism and tyranny. That is not how military command structures have ever operated, at least successful ones have ever operated. Yes, Starfleet is a rank-based structure, as are most things in the Federation. This is true, there is hierarchy, because hierarchy appears to be, inherent in all life. You see it in the animals. The whole point of sentient beings and of the Federation is not to do away with hierarchy, which is fundamentally impossible and destructive. You end up like the Borg doing that. But to access and enhance the benefits that can come with hierarchies of competence and talent and such, whilst also minimizing their more destructive tendencies. Starfleet is allowed to govern itself. That's it. In the 24th century, that's all Starfleet is allowed to do with this hierarchical command structure, is to govern itself. Now, it used to be able to govern more than just itself, and we'll get into that. But in the 24th century, no. Starfleet only has the authority to govern itself and its officers, as any military organization, as any organization needs to. His next point is just blatantly wrong, and that is the control of travel. He hypothesizes that the only way you can travel anywhere in the United Federation planets is via Starfleet, is with the OK of Starfleet Command, forgetting a vast number of characters and ships that we have encountered. Let me list off a few. Cassidy Yates and her freighter the Zosa, which she independently operates. Now, she's hardly a well-off person, I will say. She's quite a blue-collar lady. So to say that, it's just the reserve of the privilege, doesn't really hold up. The existence of the Condor-class cargo ship, the Marquis Raider, as it's more well known as, but that was originally a civilian transport and was, from what we can see, given how widely it is used throughout the demilitarized zone, was very, very popular and a very, very common ship. And then that goes doubly so for the Peregrine class, which of course started out as a civilian courier ship. I haven't even mentioned the Merchantman, which is of course a very old but very popular design of civilian cargo ship. And there's also, of course, the Raven, a civilian science vessel. Not to mention a myriad of other science ships, including, even within New Trek, the La Sirena, an independently operated yacht, so to speak. So to say that the Federation has control of travel is just simply wrong. There's vast amounts of evidence that counter this notion. We know that people are free to move about the galaxy. How do you think all these colonies spring up? Think about the episode where Data, Ensigns of Command, where Data is called upon to try and get some colonists to leave a planet. The Federation barely even knew that the people were there, because they just went there of their own accord, because you can do that in the Federation. You can't do that in the Romulan Empire, let me tell you. And probably that's why they have slightly quieter borders, is because people aren't just whizzing around the place setting up colonies wherever they like. It's a very, very common practice. Going even as far back as to original series, colonies are set up where Starfleet doesn't necessarily have any say. Think about the Gorn episode, Arena. There's a colony set up. It wasn't necessarily approved by Starfleet, but the colony was there, and oh no, it turns out we set up an enemy in Gorn space, and the Gorn are none too happy with that. Who'd have thought? Okay, next point he makes is on the control of replicators. Yet again, this is a complete assumption. We don't know who made replicators. And it's also worth pointing out that other races have replicators. Klingons have replicators. Romulans have replicators. Cardassians have replicators. This is a very common technology. Now, are they to the same standard as Federation replicators? Probably not. But we know that other races have them. And the initial applications of a replicator, that being food production and, the production of basic materials, don't really lend themselves to military purposes all that much. But they do lend themselves very well to civilian purposes. So it is my view that actually it's more likely that the replicator was created by the civilian market, and in so doing, kind of brought an end to the material civilian market. There's still, I'd say, competition of a kind, but it is now a competition for what replicatable things can be made, or indeed a non-replicatable thing can be made, because of course that is then a unique thing. I won't get too much into the economics, but the point being that it seems very likely to me that the replicator was a civilian invention, not a military one. He also goes on to talk about inequity in the Federation, that life in the core is paradise, and that in the periphery things are a lot harder. I'm going to point out that life in the core is not perfect. There's very little room to move in the densely populated core. You can't do what you like because it's highly, highly competitive. How do you think Joseph Sisko got his restaurant in New Orleans? Now, it's possible that the property was owned by the family going back generation after generation after generation. It's possible. But perhaps Joseph Sisko was the first. How did he get it? Well, it's highly likely that the local municipal government decides what kind of properties are in use and should be, and who gets them. And if you are offering to open up a restaurant, and particularly as Joseph Sisko was doing, a Creole restaurant which is evocative of the local culture and heritage, then the local municipal council would probably be very interested, as that would, preserve the traditional character of the area. Earth is basically a great big national park, at least on the surface. Under the sea and on the moon, that's maybe a little bit different, but on the surface, it's a national park. So you actually have an awful lot of government red tape which says what you can and can't do with properties, because they want to preserve the essential character of Earth. The ultimate belief is that, all cultures are equal, but each culture is unique and individual and should not be washed out. And you'll find the exact same kind of thing going on Vulcan, on Andor, Teleprime, Beta Z. Wherever you go on the Federation homeworlds, there will be pretty tight regulation as to what people can do. Now, if you want to open up your restaurant, but you can't quite beat what Joseph Sisko has, you can't quite make as good a case as Joseph Sisko did, well, you can go further out, where there's less government red tape. And again, depending on your ambition, if you want to go further and further, you want to build an entire city, you go further out still, until you get all the way out to the periphery. The people who live in the outer colonies have far less red tape and regulation and less competition as well to do what they want. All these positions that are on Earth, all these, vaunted professions are highly competitive, whereas you can live a kind of less competitive life out on the periphery, and that leaves you with much more opportunity. Now, yes, a price that you pay is a little bit less oversight, which you want. It also means less material wealth, but you can work with that. People want a challenge. People were not kicked out of Earth. The people who colonize the frontiers, the same kind of character, or a similar kind of character to the American colonists of old, inasmuch as it's that idea of, well, what's over the next horizon? And that's a very different approach, for example, to a British person, a hobbit, if you like. And those are two very different approaches and two different kinds of people, and the Federation caters to both. Finally, let's talk about Section 31. I'll point out firstly that Section 31 does little worse than any other intelligence agency would do if it had the means to do so. But I will also point out that Section 31 is a rogue splinter group. It's not an official recognized part of the Federation. Okay, there's corruption that goes on and, people maybe look the other way. But it's hardly the Tal Shiar or the Obsidian Order. It is not state-run and state-endorsed, and it's not being used, it's certainly not being used to spy and tyrannize the Federation's own citizens. In fact, it's almost entirely external in its focus. Again, you can debate the ethics of their actions, but it is far away from being the Tal Shiar or the Obsidian Order. So, with that all in mind, I want to get to the essential core here and explain why it was that Leighton's coup failed. Because according to Law Reloaded's interpretation of the Federation, Leighton should have won. Leighton's coup should have succeeded, and no one would have batted an eye, right? Because the Federation's just evil. Of course they'd let some military junta take control. So, to put it very briefly, Leighton longs after the Starfleet of old, whilst forgetting its flaws and why it fundamentally failed. He's looking for the Starfleet of the late 23rd century. You know, the red uniforms, the suspicious amount of involvement in government and executive decision-making. There's Starfleet officers sitting at the head of the Federation Council behind the President. There's also, in the main Federation Council, Starfleet officers mixed in with the delegates. When the Federation goes to Khitomer to negotiate a peace treaty with the Klingons, it's Starfleet officers who are there, who are leading that. That's very interesting. Starfleet obviously has a lot of control over national policy, especially strategic foreign policy. What happened to this suspicious amount of Starfleet control? Well, it's very likely that Starfleet got all of this control in the aftermath of the 4 Years' War, that the Federation was so frightened by the threat of Klingon invasion and how slow they were to adapt and respond that they left basically all things related to national security and defense over to Starfleet, including strategic foreign policy. However, Starfleet badly misjudged things during the Tomed incident, and as a result, got an awful lot of people killed. So after the Tomed incident, Starfleet has an awful lot more civilian oversight. The President becomes far more involved in security and foreign affairs. Starfleet kept itself politically relevant in the 24th century by emphasizing its diplomatic aspects. And in that way, you can still see that culture within Starfleet. A culture which is, not, I think, malevolent, but dangerous still. The culture of, seeking to be at the forefront. Starfleet believes in itself. Starfleet believes that it is the best to handle any situation, regardless of whether or not it actually is. And all this is to say that this Starfleet of the 24th century is Picard's Starfleet. It is a Starfleet of people like Picard, not Leighton, not Admiral Cartwright, Picard's. Leighton's coup hinged on a pragmatic view of the Federation and not an idealistic view. And for his coup to succeed, it would rely on those idealists standing by and doing nothing. Leighton's argument, fundamentally, is that the civilian administration of the Federation was too weak and too slow to respond to the threat of the Dominion, and that they needed a more decisive authoritarian leadership. Now, his entire argument hinges on the pragmatism of being prepared for a Dominion invasion, and to almost all the officers that would have been involved in this coup, he would have said, it will be fine. We won't compromise ourselves by doing this because people won't resist. As long as people don't resist, we're fine. But if people start resisting, then Leighton's entire argument falls flat on its face, because he's now the one weakening the Federation and causing discord. So basically what would have happened, even if Leighton had succeeded, even if his coup had gone off without a hitch, people like Picard and many other captains would have stood up and said, no, this is not how we operate. This is not right. This is not what the Federation stands for. We cannot compromise our principles. And yes, we will use violence to defend these principles. We will use our force to restore democracy and remove the military junta. And the junta would look very hypocritical, and the people who were backing the junta would end up doubting themselves, because they would be like, well, hang on, I don't want to fight fellow Starfleet officers. I did this to protect the Federation, not to weaken it and leave it vulnerable to the Dominion. So in that way, I still think that Leighton's coup would have failed, because you're pitting pragmatists against idealists, and idealists are far more committed to their cause than are pragmatists. And fundamentally, that is the essential nature of the Federation. It is a constant aspiration towards an ideal. And sometimes they fall short. Sometimes they don't always match up to the standards to which they would hold themselves. But they constantly aspire towards those standards and those ideals. And as I will point out, the Federation went into the Dominion War as a democracy and remained a democracy throughout, and left the Dominion War as a democracy, and therefore disproved Leighton's very argument that the democracy was too weak to face the rigours and challenges of war. The Federation proves that that was not the case. Those are my thoughts. That's my rant on Law Reloaded over. I'll be interested to see what your thoughts are, Law. Let me know in the comments below, and I will see all you guys in the next video. Thank you to my members, my loyal Navarks, Jeffrey Ballard, Tully DT, Rella, and David Reeves, my dutiful commanders, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, Philip Tye, Bird Monster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Narata, Adam Bowman, Nathaniel Mead, DM Tribal Typhoon, Gabe Logan, Mr. Fleagle, Nicholas Walsh, JC Tech Wizard, Rizel 3D, and James C. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Okolkatum Questo, Squadra Course, John Nicole, Athys Collection, Tobias Klein, Greg Martin, and Shermos. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.